We just discussed the concept of intersectionality and how the various categories and markers of identity intersect and even overlap, right? Again, it's important to remember that these categories are not isolated from each other, they're not independent from other categories. That identity is not just additive, meaning you don't just add together all these categories that belong to you, for example, in terms of race, gender, social class, religion, sexuality, language, and so on. Rather, these categories, to use their term, co-construct each other, co-construction, okay? And this means that each category shapes and influences other categories rather than just, existing side by side with them. Okay? So now we can focus more specifically on gender and sexuality. And let's recall our discussion of race as being a social construction, that we create race. Eventually, these constructions become normalized or naturalized, natural way of thinking about how people could be differentiated based on skin color and physical characteristics, and also non-physical characteristics. So just as race is a social construction, so too is gender a social construction. Just as race has a history of change, for example, right? So too does gender. You could look back at how people thought about gender years ago or even centuries ago and see how different it is compared to how we think about it today, for example. So, the notion of social construction obviously is applied to gender in this case, right? We create gender rather than gender existing naturally, so to speak. Now, for some, this seems counterintuitive at first glance, right? And this is because gender is often conceived as static, as unchanging, as permanent, right? Rather than it being, created by people as a social construction. And of course, if you think of gender as being static, again, it becomes normalized through socialization, through the years, through the decades and centuries, right? To the point where you don't even question it. You assume it's natural. Okay. Now, this brings us to some distinctions here that are often used interchangeably. Okay. But there are conceptual and analytical distinctions between these three terms: sex, gender, and sexuality. Okay. So, the first term, sex, well, that refers to biology, okay, biological distinctions. So think, for example, of, sexual organs, sexual traits, right? Even genetic, like XX versus XY chromosomes, all right? That is biological, okay? That is even genetic. And there's no denying that. And then you have gender. And gender, rather than it being biological, this, on the other hand, is profoundly cultural. It's even psychological. Certainly, it's social. Okay, but here is where lots of the confusion is based on. We often use sex and gender interchangeably. Think, for example, when you're filling out an application, right? It may ask your gender, or it may be asking for your sex, right? The two terms are used interchangeably. Now, what's interesting about that is in our example of the two terms being used interchangeably on, let's say, an application, notice the function there. It seems to assume that it's normal to think about sex and gender as, interchangeable, synonymous terms. At the same time, it functions to perpetuate the misbelief that they are in fact biological, right? Both of them, gender and sex, right? When in fact, gender is cultural, as we notice, it's social. Okay, so going back to the question, why is gender typically understood in this way as static and permanent and fixed? And, hopefully that gave you an answer, right? Indeed, for many, gender is seen as permanent, as natural, and hopefully the parallel to race is readily apparent to you, right? Race being seen as natural, when in fact it's a social construction, and you could see the parallel with that, and gender seen as natural, when in fact it is social. So why did this happen? Why do we tend to think that gender is not a social construction? Well, this goes back to, again, using these terms synonymously, we conflate gender and sex. That is, we believe that they are synonymous and interchangeable, just like on that application, right? So therefore, if sex is fixed and natural, as we defined here in the slide, then so too is gender. Okay, in other words, it's a misconception when we say that if sex is fixed and it's natural, then it naturally follows that gender is also fixed and natural. Okay. For example, one may reason about this conflation along these lines. Well, clearly there are people that are biologically men, and there are people that are biologically women. Moreover, there seems to be a correspondence between biology and behavior, right? Gender roles, gender behavior, and what have you. So therefore, the two must be synonymous. So again, the main point here is that genetic and sex differences between men and women are not the same as gender differences. As we've been discussing, sex is biological, it is indeed genetic, but gender is cultural, it's social, it's even psychological. In other words, it's a social construction created by people. Okay, another way to say this is that, sure, children are born with sex chromosomes, XX or XY. They are born with sex organs, but they are not born with gender. Okay, so just like racial classification, you see gender the way it's practiced, right? The way you see gender roles and behavior, it varies across cultures today. It varies in the historical past, and then somehow gender becomes seen as real, right? Now, I just mentioned that even today there are some societies that do not assume or presuppose or take as normal, quote unquote, this notion of just two genders, right? Based on the fact that sexuality is based on this dualism, right? So here's an example that we could see in India and Pakistan. And this is the Hijra. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right, but Hijra, okay? And basically, it's a third gender, okay? It's assumed to be a natural way that gender is understood, that gender is practiced in India, in Pakistan, right? They don't even question it. It's assumed to be natural, right? So here is a country and a society whereby three genders is just assumed to be natural. And compare that with, for example, in most of the Western world and other non-Western societies, of course, but they just assume it's not three, but two genders, and that's natural, right? So, which one is more correct, right? In India, you have 1 billion people there. Are 1 billion people correct? Or is the United States more correct when it comes to gender, right? And there only being two, so to speak. At least that's the belief that many people hold, right? And again, I keep going back to that example of the application because, the application administratively just assumes there are two, right, genders, and they're using the term sex and gender interchangeably. Okay, another example would be in the past. If this is in the present, then in the past you had many Native American societies and cultures believing in a third gender as well, and they call this the two spirits, right? And this was assumed to be natural in those communities. And again, they didn't question it the same way we tend not to question the natural existence, quote unquote, of two genders. Okay? So these are just a couple of examples out of numerous that you could cite, actually, whereby gender is more complicated than we believe it is. So again, just like race and racial classification, the way gender is understood, the way it's practiced, the way it's classified, it varies across cultures and history. So the question becomes, how does gender become seen as quote unquote real, just like race is often seen as quote real? Well, the answer to that is that gender is normalized and seen as real through the process of socialization, in our human interactions with each other. In the words of a well-known social scientist of gender, quote, people do gender, okay? People do gender. It's an action, right? So what do they mean by this? People do gender, okay? And when you think about that, the verb to do, right? It's active again. It's not just a static category, right? It involves action and socialization, right? So here are some ways you could think about it when people do gender. Well, from the very beginning, even as infants, right? Infants are treated in gender terms, even once they are born. Actually, even before they're born sometimes, right? When you have a, quote, gender reveal party, right? What are they doing there? They're confusing sex and gender, right? Moreover, it involves the colors blue or pink. What's interesting about that is blue thought to be naturally corresponding with males, right? And of course, pink corresponding naturally with girls. Well, if you go back about 100 years earlier, pink was for boys. Okay, so things reversed, but that just emphasizes how gender is a social construction, right? This idea of natural correspondence, right? So again, infants, even before they're born with a gender reveal party, they're treated in gender terms. And then when they're actually born, let's say in the hospital, everyone around them, the doctors, the nurses, certainly the parents and visitors, they are treated, the infants that is, the infants are treated in gender terms by everyone around them, right? This is doing gender, so to speak. And you could continue from there, which we will in the next slide.